I have watched a great many men make fools of themselves over women. I say this not as a cynic. I am Edmund Cale, Lord of Briarstone, and I have loved my own wife with the whole of my chest since the autumn of 1807. But as a man who stood beside the Duke of Harclay for 30 years and witnessed, firsthand, the precise and magnificent moment when the most feared nobleman in the north of England walked into Thornley Park's winter ballroom, surveyed 400 of the most titled, most beautiful, and most elaborately arranged people in the country, and crossed the entire length of the floor to speak to a young woman who was reading a book. Not dancing, not flirting, not performing the elaborate ritual of the season as every other woman in that room had prepared herself to perform it. Reading. Alone. In the corner nearest the window, where the candlelight was just bright enough and the noise was not quite so terrible, with her feet tucked beneath her skirts and her dark head bent over the page as though the rest of the ballroom. The silk gowns, the diamond tiaras, the gentlemen circling like well-dressed birds of prey, did not exist at all. I watched him see her. That is the thing I must make clear, because everything else follows from it. I was standing at Harclay's right shoulder, which was where I had stood for most of the previous decade, and I saw his gaze travel the room in that cold, systematic way he had, the way that made hostesses nervous and lesser men straighten their cravats, and then stop. Just stop, like a watch whose spring has caught. He said nothing. For perhaps half a minute he said absolutely nothing, which was unremarkable, because Harclay rarely said anything at a ball. What was remarkable was that he did not move on. Every other time I had watched him survey a room, his gaze moved through it, efficient, joyless, complete. And then he would say something to me in a low voice such as, "Cale, I shall need a drink." Or, "That is the third time Rotherfield has tried to catch my eye and I am leaving before he succeeds." But this time the survey simply ceased. The room fell away. He was looking at one point, and only one point, and that point was a young woman in a dress the color of winter fog, reading what appeared to be a book about the migration patterns of birds. "Who is that?" he said. I looked the woman with the book. "There is only one person in this room with a book, Cale." "Miss Carow," I said after a moment of recollection. "Winifred Carow. She has come as companion to Lady Elspeth Pendray, the Countess of Drewton's niece, the one with the yellow gown who has been pointing herself in your direction since you arrived. Miss Carow is the daughter of a governess. She was schooled above her station, and has, I believe, been made to feel the incongruence of that fact at every possible opportunity. She has no fortune and no prospects, and has been told so at length by everyone who knows her." Harclay looked at me then, briefly. "And what does she do?" "She reads," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and I felt it before I heard it, a shift in his posture, a decision made, he said, "I am going to speak to her." I did not argue. I had learned long ago that the moments when Harclay chose to act were moments worth watching. I should give you the full portrait of the room, because you need it to understand what happened next. Thornley Park was the grandest house in 3 counties, and its ballroom was the grandest room in Thornley Park. A long, vaulted space with chandeliers 30 feet above the floor and walls paneled in pale gold silk and windows that ran from floor to ceiling along the eastern side. The Marchioness of Thornley had organized this particular winter gathering with the specific and undisguised intention of introducing the Duke of Harclay to a suitable bride, and she had done so with the thoroughness of a military campaign. There were 14 young women of title present, each of whom had been positioned, costumed, and rehearsed. There were their mothers, watchful as hawks. There were their fathers, studiously casual. There were the gentlemen who had also been invited and who knew, by the particular quality of the Marchioness's smile when she greeted them, that they were scenery. And there was Winifred Carow in the corner, who had not been included in any of this planning, who was there only because Lady Elspeth Pendray required a companion and could not be troubled to attend to her own amusement, and so had brought Miss Carow as a sort of upright furniture piece, a presence to occupy a chair and look grateful for the invitation. I had spoken to Miss Carow briefly, earlier in the evening, when Lady Elspeth had been drawn away by the Marchioness, and Miss Carow had been left standing beside the refreshment table with an expression of composed and absolute patience. I had offered her a glass of ratafia, and she had accepted it, and thanked me with a directness that was rather refreshing. We had spoken, I cannot now remember precisely what about, some question I had asked about the book she carried under her arm, and she had answered with a kind of easy intelligence that reminded me, oddly, of a conversation at my club rather than of any other exchange, I had had that evening with any woman in silk. Then Lady Elspeth had returned, and Miss Carrow had stepped back 2 paces into a polite and practiced invisibility, and Lady Elspeth had not introduced her, and Miss Carrow had not expected her to. She had taken herself, at some point in the next hour, to the corner by the window, where she had found a chair that no one else wanted and arranged herself in it and opened her book, and that was where she had remained. I watched Harkley cross the floor. I want you to understand what it looked like to watch this because the room noticed. He was not a man who moved without being noticed. He was tall and broad across the shoulder, and he had a face that people described afterward in different terms depending on whether they feared him or admired him, but all the descriptions agreed on the quality of attention it conveyed. He did not look like a man performing something. He never did. He looked like a man who had decided. 400 people watched him cross that floor and tried to determine who he was crossing it to reach, and the answer, when it became apparent, was a confusion so perfect that several women simply stopped speaking mid-sentence. Lady Elspeth Pendray, who had been rotating herself at a 45-degree angle to the Duke's direction of movement ever since he arrived, understood first, and her expression was a remarkable thing. I followed at a respectful distance, which was near enough to hear and far enough to be unobtrusive. She did not look up when he reached her. I believe she did not know he was there. The candlelight was behind him rather than in front, and she was, I think, genuinely absorbed in the chapter she was reading. He stood before her chair for perhaps 3 seconds before she turned a page, glanced up to mark her place with a finger, and then looked at him. She did not startle, I noticed that. She looked at him as though looking at anyone, not with the calculated softness that every other woman in the room had rehearsed, not with the wide-eyed flutter, not with the practiced surprise of a woman who has been waiting to be approached. She simply looked at him, took in what she saw, and waited to see what he would do. "You are reading," he said. "I am," she agreed. "I apologize, I did not intend it as a slight to the dancing." "It is not a slight," he said. "It is rather the most interesting thing in the room." He looked at the cover of her book. "The Bretherton Papers, you have taste." She looked at him for a moment, measuring, unself-conscious, and then said, "You have read it." "I have read it 3 times," he said. "The chapter on the northern passages is imperfect." Bretherton did not account for the seasonal variation. I have always thought his conclusions sound, but his evidence careless. A pause. "I have been arguing precisely that with myself for the last half-hour," she said, and there was something in her voice then, not the careful brightness of a woman performing, but the genuine, slightly startled warmth of a person who has encountered an unexpected equal. "His maps are beautiful. His reasoning in Chapter 7 is the sloppiest I have read in a scientific work published in the last 20 years. He sat down, not on the chair beside her, on the low window ledge, which was not entirely proper and which he did not appear to care about in the least. "What would you have done differently?" he said. And she told him. I stood at a distance and watched the Duke of Harkley lean forward over his knees and listened to Winifred Carrow explain, with careful and eloquent precision, how she would have reorganized the evidence in 3 chapters of a natural history publication that she had read once 2 months ago and retained entire. He argued with her. Properly argued, not condescension dressed as engagement, but the real thing. He pushed back on one of her points about the Eastern migration. She held her ground and gave him a better answer, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, simply, "You are right." I have never heard Harkley say that to anyone at a social gathering in 30 years. Behind me, I was aware of the room rearranging itself around this fact. The Marchioness had gone quite still near the entrance to the refreshment room. Lady Elspeth Pendray had drifted, with an expression of strained bewilderment, several feet closer to the corner. The 14 arranged young women and their mothers were performing, collectively, the most impressively controlled panic I had ever witnessed. None of this reached the corner. They talked for what I later calculated to be 40 minutes. I know this because the dancing stopped and restarted, and a supper interval came and went, and was over before either of them moved. She told him about the translation she had been attempting on her own of a Flemish natural history from the previous century. Her Flemish was, apparently, sufficient for the task, though she said this without ceremony, the way one mentions that one is left-handed. He told her about his own library at Harkley, which contained 3 letters from the author of that same Flemish text. And at the mention of this, she went very still for a moment, and then looked at him with an expression of such naked scholarly hunger that I found myself smiling from across the room. "You would like to see them," he said. "I would like to see them very much indeed," she said. "Then you shall." The simplicity of that, the certainty in it, made her look at him differently for a moment. Not with calculation, with something quieter and less practiced. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have not expected to find in the middle of an ordinary evening. He did not miss it. He was not a man who missed things. It was at precisely this juncture that Lady Elspeth Pendray chose to intervene. I will not call it graceful. Lady Elspeth was a handsome woman of 24 with excellent teeth, and a temperament that her admirers described as spirited, and her companions described, more accurately, as relentless. She appeared at the edge of the conversation with the bright, sharp energy of a woman who had been watching something belong to someone else for 40 minutes, and had decided that this had gone on long enough. "Miss Carrow," she said, with a smile that would not have convinced anyone, "I need you." Miss Carrow looked up. There was a steadiness in her gaze, the steadiness of a woman who had been managed by other women for most of her life and had developed, through long practice, an absolute economy of self in the face of it. "Of course," she said, and began to close her book. "She need not go," said Harkley. Lady Elspeth's smile did not waver, though something behind it did. "Your Grace is too kind," she said, deploying the phrase as a closing argument. "But I am afraid Miss Carrow is here in her capacity as my companion, and I find I require her." "Your Grace," said Harkley pleasantly, "is not too kind. Your Grace is perfectly clear." He did not look at Lady Elspeth when he said this. He was looking at Miss Carrow. "You are not required," he said to her. "You are being removed. Those are two different things." Lady Elspeth drew breath. Harkley stood. This had the effect it generally had. The conversation around them paused, the way weather pauses before something decisive occurs. He was, when he chose to be, very much present in a room. "Miss Carrow," he said, and his voice was perfectly audible to the 6 or 8 people now paying careful attention to this corner. "I have not finished our conversation, and I find that when I have not finished a conversation, I should like to continue it. Would you care to walk with me?" A beat. The beat of a woman who has been somebody's furniture for long enough that being asked what she would care to do has the quality of a small shock. "Yes," she said, "I believe I would." He offered her his arm. I have seen Harkley offer his arm to women perhaps 4 times in the course of my acquaintance with him. Each time it was not a social performance. It was a declaration. She took it and rose from the chair that had been her exile for the better part of the evening, and walked with him, the Duke of Harkley, whose name on a guest list raised the value of the event by 20 degrees, back across the full length of that glittering, gasping ballroom, through 400 people who parted for them and watched them go and understood, in the collective, unspoken way that these things are always understood, that something had just happened. Lady Elspeth stood in the corner by the window with the book that Miss Carrow had left behind. She had not thought to bring it, and her expression was a thing I will treasure for the remainder of my life. They walked in the conservatory for an hour, while the ball wound down around them and the Marchioness of Thornley moved through her own party with the distracted energy of a woman revising her plans. When they came in, the supper room was nearly empty. Harkley brought her a plate, which was another thing I had not previously seen him do for anyone. They sat at the far end of the long table and talked in low voices, and once, I saw it from across the room, she laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has discovered, late and without warning, that some essential thing has been missing from his rooms for a long time, and he has been so accustomed to the absence that he forgot to notice it. She went home, that is, she returned to Lady Elspeth's borrowed townhouse at midnight. I do not know what passed between them in that final exchange, only that it was brief, and that she was composed when she turned to go, and that he watched the carriage until it had rounded the corner of the drive and disappeared. "Well," I said, coming to stand beside him in the cold air of the entrance portico. "Don't," he said. "I am not going to say anything." "You were going to say something insufferable." "I was going to say," I said, "that you have had a very productive evening." He was quiet for a moment. The last of the carriages were assembling on the gravel below us. "She is the most intelligent person I have spoken to in 8 months," he said. This was offered in a tone of some grievance. as though intelligence in an unexpected source was a personal inconvenience. "Longer than that, I suspect," I said. He did not argue with me. He went back inside. What followed the 3 weeks between that ball and the Thornley musicale at which Harkley called formally on Miss Caro, much to the bafflement of the assembled company, I witnessed in pieces. I know that he wrote to her twice. I know she wrote back, once with a postscript about a secondary source she had located on the Bretherton question, which she sent under separate cover, and which he read, according to his own account, 4 times. I know that he called on Lady Elspeth Pendray's household on the pretext of returning a volume he had borrowed, which was a pretext of such transparent construction that even Lady Elspeth's butler raised an eyebrow. Lady Elspeth herself was not pleased. She was, in point of fact, spectacularly not pleased, in the way that beautiful women who have understood themselves to be the destination of a thing are not pleased to discover they were scenery all along. She said several things to Miss Caro in the privacy of her own drawing-room that I was not present for, but that I heard about afterward from Miss Caro herself, years later, when she could speak of it with the serenity of someone who has long since ceased to be surprised by what frightened people will say. She had said nothing in response to any of it. This was not passivity. This was, I came to understand, a principled and long-practiced art, the art of not allowing someone else's diminishment of her to become the truth. She had learned it the way people learn the things they must, through the sheer accumulation of occasions on which it was required. What she had done in the weeks between the ball and the musicale was continue. She had written her letters to the Duke. She had continued her translation. She had done what Lady Elspeth required of her companion with the efficiency and composure of someone fulfilling a function, and in the hours that were her own she had been, simply, herself. I believe this is what undid him, finally. Not the intelligence, though that was real and he valued it as few men of his station were prepared to value it in a woman. It was the stillness of her, the fact that she was entirely, unapologetically there, reading in the corner, or arguing about a chapter, or taking his arm across a ballroom, without performing any of it. He had spent 30 years in rooms full of performance. He had not known he was exhausted by it until he sat beside someone who wasn't doing it. The Thornley musicale was 3 weeks after the ball in the same house, with a rather different composition of guests, smaller, more deliberate. The Marchioness had understood something of what had occurred and had, to her considerable credit, adjusted her approach. She had invited Miss Caro in her own right, not as Lady Elspeth's companion. The card had been addressed to Miss Winifred Caro. Lady Elspeth had not been invited at all. I do not know who told Lady Elspeth this. I imagine it reached her with the velocity of things that are intended to sting. Miss Caro arrived alone, that is, without the shelter of someone else's rank, and the room understood what this meant. A dozen women of title watched her cross the entry hall. Their expressions were an education in social arithmetic, calculating, disbelieving, and in several cases making rapid recalibrations. Harkley was there when she arrived. He had been there for some time before her. He was at the far end of the music room, standing with 2 other gentlemen, and I watched him mark the moment she entered, a precise, unhurried attention, as though he had been waiting without appearing to wait, and then he excused himself from the conversation he was having and came to greet her. He bowed over her hand. This was not remarkable in itself. It was what came next that was. He held her hand for a moment longer than the form required and said, quietly enough that it was only I and perhaps 2 others who heard it, "You found the secondary source I mentioned." "I did," she said. "You were right about the date of publication. I was wrong." "You were not wrong," he said. "The date was ambiguous. You followed the more reasonable interpretation." A pause. "I have the letters from the archive. I had them brought from Harkley. They are in the library. Will you come and see them?" She looked at him steadily, as she always looked at him. "Now." "After the recital," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. And it was there, at that moment, in that exchange, which was as unadorned and unsentimental as any 2 people agreeing to look at old letters in a library, that I understood with complete certainty what was going to happen. The recital was performed, 3 pieces, an adequate soprano, a young man who played the pianoforte with more enthusiasm than technique. Harkley sat beside Miss Caro throughout, and they spoke very little, and when they did it was in the low-voiced shorthand of people who have already covered the territory of introductions, and are now simply present together. I sat 2 seats away and watched the room watching them, and the room's expression was, collectively, the expression of something that has been told one story for a very long time and is being given a different ending. After the recital, they went to the library. 3 of us followed, I, and the Marchioness, who went on some pretext of pointing out the collection's arrangement, and a Miss Harriet Vane, who was, I think, simply curious and did not bother to pretend otherwise. Harkley produced the letters from a slender case on the reading table and laid them out, and Miss Carrow bent over them with an attention that made me think of a musician looking at a score, total, absorbed, reverential. She translated the first one aloud without hesitation from the Flemish, and it was only when she finished and looked up and found 3 faces looking at her that she seemed to recall herself and said composedly, "Forgive me. The phrasing is unusual." The Marchioness of Thornley, who was 62 years old and had not arrived at her position by being slow, said, "Miss Carrow, how many languages do you speak?" "A beat, 5 with fluency," she said, "2 more with tolerable competency." Silence. Harkley did not say anything. He did not need to. He was looking at her with an expression that was not surprise, he had known or suspected, but was something else. Pride, perhaps, though that is not quite the right word for it. The satisfaction of a man who has said a thing to himself in private and is watching it confirmed in public. "Lady Thornley," he said after a moment, "I should like to ask your permission to call on Miss Carrow formally tomorrow morning." He looked at the Marchioness. "And as she is not, to my knowledge, under the guardianship of any household currently present, I am asking you as the hostess, in whose home she is a guest." This was, I recognized, a precise and deliberate thing. He was giving Miss Carrow the dignity of a formal call, arranged with a witness before a respected member of society. He was refusing to allow this to be anything other than what he intended it to be, which was a matter of public and unambiguous record. The Marchioness said, "Of course, Your Grace." He did not look triumphant. He looked at ease. The particular ease of a man who has carried a decision for some time and has finally done the thing he decided to do. He looked at Miss Carrow then, and she was looking at him, and her face was not the face of a woman being claimed against her will or without her understanding. She was not a woman swept away. She was a woman who saw exactly what was happening and was, quietly and with her whole self, choosing it. "Tomorrow," he said to her. "Tomorrow," she agreed. I called on her myself the following morning before Harkley arrived because I have always been too curious for my own good. I found her in the small sitting room that the Marchioness had assigned to her, a pleasanter room than her status as an unsponsored guest would normally warrant. Lady Thornley's recalibrations had been swift and thorough. She was writing. Of course she was writing. She looked up when I was shown in and offered me a chair and tea, and we sat in the pale winter light and talked, and she was, as she had always been, exactly herself. I said to her after a while, "Are you frightened?" She considered this with the seriousness she gave most questions. "No," she said at last, "I have been frightened quite often in my life. I was frightened when my mother died and I was 17 and had to manage alone. I was frightened when Lady Elspeth told me I was fit only to carry her shawl because I believed her briefly, and that frightened me more than her saying it. I am not frightened now." She paused. "He sees me," she said simply. "He actually sees what is there. That is a very unusual experience, and I find that it does not frighten me at all. It is rather the most clarifying thing I have ever encountered." I left before Harkley arrived. This was a conversation I did not need to witness. I heard about it afterward in pieces. I know that he came at 10 in the morning. I know that they spent 3 hours in the library together, finishing the discussion of the Flemish letters that the musicale had interrupted, and that somewhere in the course of the 3rd hour he said what he had decided to say. She told me later that he said it simply, without ornament, that he told her he was not a man who spoke carelessly about matters of consequence, and that she was, to him, a matter of great consequence, and that he had no interest in proceeding as though that were not the case. She had said, and this is the thing I love most about her, the thing that is most perfectly herself, that she had no interest in proceeding as though it were not the case either. He came to find me at my club that evening. He walked in at 7:30 and sat down across from me and looked, for perhaps the first time since I had known him at 33 years old, like a man who has put down something heavy. "Cale," he said. "Harkley," I said. "I am engaged," he said. I ordered us both a drink. We sat in the old chairs by the fire, and the familiar noise of the club moved around us, and I looked at my oldest friend and saw, in his face, the expression of a man who has found, unexpectedly and entirely without planning for it, the thing he did not know he had been missing. "She will transform your library," I said. "She already has," he said. "She reorganized the Eastern alcove in the Flemish archive correspondence by region rather than by date. She is entirely correct that the date system was useless." He paused. "She is going to be very difficult to argue with." "You argued with her 3 days ago," I said. "She won," he said, and there was, in the way he said it, no grievance at all, only a quiet, steady satisfaction. I raised my glass. The wedding was in April. The church was a small and ancient one, Harcley's own parish at the edge of his estate, which suited them both. There were no arrangements of elaborate performance. There was a great deal of spring light through old windows, and Miss Winifred Caro in a gown the color of cream, and the Duke of Harcley at the front of a church looking at the door with the focused, still attention of a man who has decided and is simply now waiting. I stood beside him, as I had stood beside him at the ball when all of this began. She came through the door and walked up the aisle, and she was not performing that either. She walked the way she did everything, with her whole self, present and particular, not looking anywhere except where she was going. He took her hand, and I watched his face, and I want to tell you what was in it. Certainty. The absolute, unperformable certainty of a man who has, in his life, been afraid of very few things and is not afraid of this. This is the right person, and I have found her, and there is nothing left to do but be, from now and entirely, precisely this. Lady Elspeth Pendray sent a gift. It was the correct size for a silver tea service, and contained, in fact, a silver tea service, which arrived with a card of congratulation in handwriting so forcefully controlled it left impressions through the paper. Miss Caro, the Duchess of Harcley, placed it on the mantelpiece in the blue sitting room and said nothing about it except to observe once that it was very well made. She did not say it was generous. She was, as I have told you, a precise and honest woman. 3 months into the marriage, I dined at Harcley and found the library transformed. The eastern alcove had been, as promised, entirely reorganized, and there were new acquisitions along the southern wall: a Flemish natural history in 3 volumes, a set of maps, 2 journals of a scholarly society neither Harcley nor I had previously heard of, obtained through a correspondence that she appeared to be conducting with scholars in 4 countries simultaneously. Harcley watched me examine the additions with the expression of a man who is fully, helplessly pleased. "Is she always like this?" I asked. "She is always exactly like this," he said. After dinner we sat in the drawing room, the 3 of us, and the fire was warm and the house was quiet, and the Duchess of Harcley was reading. Naturally, she was reading. She was always reading. And the Duke of Harcley was watching her read with an expression of such unguarded contentment that I found I had to look away briefly, because some things are too private to witness, even between old friends. I thought of the ballroom at Thornley Park, the chandeliers and the silk gowns and the 400 elaborately arranged, elaborately performing people. I thought of the corner by the window, and the chair that nobody wanted, and the book about migration patterns, and the young woman who was reading it as though the rest of the world did not exist. She had not been invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply been in a room full of people who were not looking. He walked across the room. He sat down and said, "What are you reading?" And the rest of it, the library at midnight, the letters from the Flemish archive, 3 hours in a sitting room talking about Chapter 7, was simply the consequence of 2 people who see one another actually seeing. He told me once in the first year that she was the only person he had ever spoken to who did not want something from him. Not his title, not his rank, not his land, not his attention as a currency or his name as a door. Only the conversation itself, only the actual specific fact of him. He had not known, he said, until that he had wanted that. He had thought, perhaps, that wanting it was too much to ask of the world. It was not too much. It was simply a matter of finding the right corner of the right room on the right winter evening and having the sense, or the grace, to cross the floor. I was there, I watched him cross it, and I will tell you, as a man who has witnessed a great deal and forgotten rather less, I have seen the precise moment of a great many things in my life, and most of them I have carried quietly and without record. This one I set down, because she deserved to have someone set it down. She was the woman in the corner, reading her book in the January candlelight, and she had always been worth crossing the room for. He was simply at last the man who knew it.